To another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Shepley here. And on today's episode, we got Matt Nelson joining us to talk a little NIL settlement and some Georgia Bulldogs, dude. It's great to have you on, and really excited to have you on and talk some ball.
Man, I appreciate the invite. Always happy to spend this off season talking college football, just talking NIL. We got the huge house settlement coming up. We'll see how that kind of unfolds here.
Yeah, exactly. It's just nice to have some new faces, some new voices in the mix too, and everything. And obviously we've heard about the house settlement for months and months and months now, and now we're kind of getting to the point where we have a sort of broad idea in terms of what some of the changes are going to be, but we also don't exactly know what some of the consequences are going to be or what the potential consequences are going to be. But for our audience here, I'm just going to just bullet point the three biggest things that are obviously contingent upon final federal court approval. But the biggest things, obviously, are bullet point one, permitting schools to provide full scholarships to student athletes on a roster, essentially eliminating sport to sport scholarship maximums. The second part of it is the $20.5 million pool that's going to be directed as financial benefits to all the student athletes. So all the schools are going to be able to say, hey, we have this $20.5 million budget, figure out what you want to do with it. And obviously the third part of it is introducing rules that are intended to bring clarity and stability to the NIL environment, such as allowing for independent review for third-party agreements between student athletes and entities, and essentially trying to not blur the lines as much between the collective and the school, and kind of allowing the school a little bit more to be involved in the financial aspect of it. So with that said, obviously there are more changes than just that. I'm just kind of rattling off the main ones, but what were some of your initial thoughts when you were reading this through, and what are some of the consequences that you see, particularly within a college football lens? Because I know this is applicable to all sports, but just within college ball, what are your general thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, like I said, how it all unfolds. I'm curious to see, what players may or may not get grandfathered in. I haven't had a chance to go through and listen to it, but I know that, Mike Alford from Florida State had some big thoughts on it. So I want to go and listen to see what he has, especially coming off, that 2-10 season. The thing that I love the most, though, is not only does this help, like you said, all sports, all athletes, this new thing also doubles the scholarships available in women's sports. So I'm a huge, supporter of women's sports here locally. We love the soccer team, softball team, and so hopefully that allows them to be able to take advantage of NIL and all this just as much, or if not closer to the men's. But I also thought it was interesting too that the sharing cap is going to increase 4% each year throughout this 10-year deal if it goes through, which will be interesting to see kind of how smaller schools deal with that as opposed to some of these bigger, larger Power Fives like your Ohio States, like your Michigans, even going across the other side, going to USC. So I think those were the two bigger ones that I looked at, and I also saw that I guess it takes into contact the former athletes who starting in 2016, leading all the way up to
Yeah.
last year. So
Yeah, because my general understanding is that there's some money in a pool for any athlete from 2016 and beyond. So I guess they're going to get their little cut of it. And like you said, I think that the smaller schools, that's definitely one bigger thing that I generally see, because for anybody who watches this program regularly knows that I'm definitely more of a college football traditionalist. Like, I would be okay with the BCS model. I'd be okay with two teams in the playoff. Like, I would be completely content with with not having any of these changes. But nevertheless, I am trying to be as open-minded as I can. But when I think about some of these changes, my first thought is there's going to get to be a point where, sort of like the Premier League, which I'm a huge fan of, there's going to be, 10, 15 schools that are just going to dominate college football. And then there's going to be kind of all these other schools who are kind of just sort of muddling in the middle. And granted, I guess you can argue to a degree that it's sort of like that right now. But I push back on that when I think about, TCU, for example, who, was in the national championship, even though they got their ass whooped. I go back and think of Cincinnati a couple of years ago. So, I mean, there are teams that I guess you wouldn't necessarily think are like sort of the dominant teams. But at the same time, too, when you have these rules in place, I think it's only going to get more and more difficult, too, especially when you think about, too, that not many of these athletic departments really are profitable. In fact, majority of them lose money.
Yeah, it's usually I know I can only speak for Florida State. I saw the revenue sharing not too long ago, and it was football at so many schools essentially drives the boat or the car, whatever vehicle euphemism you want to use, but it does, and it takes into account. So you have to take the football money and kind of dish it out to other programs, and depending on how your revenue sharing is set up, if you're if it's like in the ACC where it doesn't matter where you finish, you're still going to get a piece of the pie, or you're in the SEC where depending on where you finish, you're getting a bigger chunk of the money. I think that also will play a big role into how this house settlement works.
Yeah, because I don't want to get too off topic, but part of the ACC revenue agreement is that's exactly why the Clemson and Notre Dame did this agreement together, because they're like, hey, if we can band together and create the biggest games that the television networks are going to want to see, then naturally that's what's going to happen. And then the schools like the Boston Colleges, the Wake Forests, Virginia, those are the schools that are ultimately going to end up getting screwed from this whole thing.
I think that's why you're starting to see schools like FSU, like Clemson. They're trying to kind of break out and go to a conference like we saw last year. With USC leaving and coming to the Big Ten. I think everybody's kind of trying to scramble to maybe get into one of these conferences that I think we're going to maybe see either two or three large Mac Daddy conferences, and that's just going to be it. If you get left out, you get left out, and it might end up being like the Premier League, like you said, where you have kind of this upper echelon, and then maybe you have a league or two down below.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point with that too, and I'm going to ask you a little bit more of an open-ended question that's sort of similar to this, but we talked a couple seconds ago about how obviously there's an echelon, then there's schools that just simply have more money than other schools, and at least in my opinion, how I would interpret this is part of the idea is you're kind of phasing out the whole collective aspect, because eventually if the schools are just negotiating directly with the agents, the collective is kind of more of just a kind of band of private people who kind of just help donate the school and maybe are kind of a middleman. So what are your general thoughts on the collectives in general kind of going away? Do you think it's for the best that the schools are directing with the agents, or are you a little bit more in favor of having kind of that middleman aspect to it?
I think you can go at it from a number of different ways. I think there's pros and cons to it. I think some of the cons is that it could end up hurting college football as a whole. And I'm kind of like you. I try to be open minded about where college football is going. But I enjoy the like you said, the old BCS days. I think I try not to get off topic here, but when they brought up the whole playoff thing, I was okay with it. I thought maybe we could do, if you do like a 6-team thing where, the first and the second team get a bye and then you have the next four. Um, but yeah, I think that, a pro is that middleman kind of helps. I don't want to say keep things on track, I guess, a little bit, but like I said, I'm still waiting to see how it really unfolds. I'm curious to see where we get how they deal with this, and if they ended up needing to go to trial, or if they ended up solving it in federal court.
Yeah, because I guess where I push back on the whole fact that the schools can pay the athletes now, I think about this. I think it's gonna be a bigger issue for the state schools. Like that's where I think it's really gonna get complicated, because then you get into a conversation of, well, are these kids technically employees now, since the state is technically paying these kids X amount of dollars to be able to play elsewhere? For example, the University of Kentucky, they just made their whole athletic department an LLC now. And so that's it's moving towards that business element of that. But at the same time, I think I mentioned this a couple seconds ago that the college football, how it is in this second right now, is very similar to Premier League in the sense that there's really no salary cap and there is this sort of collective that kind of just negotiates. I think there is an element of that ultimately is good, because I think if there's any way that you can kind of separate the schools and the payments from the athletes, I think it ultimately is cleaner. But you're going to get to a point where so much money is going to come in that you're just not going to be able to rely on a makeshift collective to kind of really put all this together too. Now that you have whole scouting departments, whole general managers, whole front offices now, to the point where it's just going to be a part of it, whether you like it or not, especially if you're a Power 4 school. I mean, even the Stanfords and the UCals of the world who, haven't been, I guess, as successful as you'd like them to be in the past, 5-8 years or so, they're going to have to start investing just as heavy as Ohio State and all them are if they actually want to be legitimate and relevant in this day and age of college football.
I mean, you bring up Stanford. I mean, if you ask somebody, about Stanford football, the two things they're going to tell you are going to be, Christian McCaffrey and Andrew Luck. That's otherwise what is Stanford giving you to talk about? That's it. And it's because they haven't, maybe put in as much, time and money or focus on football. The same thing, I think with Utah, until, recently in the last couple of years, you haven't really thought about Utah as a football school. I think about, when Urban Meyer was back, coaching before he went to Florida, and, you feel like they really get shafted because of how the BCS was set up. You have an undefeated team that he was coaching at the time that seemed like they were a TCU-esque who they deserved at least a shot. And and I understand why people love the playoff, is because teams like that now get a shot, whether or not they get, their doors blown off, 52-7 or whatever it was, with TCU. I can see why they want to give these teams a shot. And
right.
You can't, but you also then can't turn around and say, well, we're not going to give this team a shot this year because of what TCU did last year, if every year is supposed to be a different individual year.
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword, because in one regard you want to give the some of these smaller schools a chance at legitimately winning the national title, because that's just simply the model that they're doing. But at the same time, my counterpoint would be, well, you're diluting the product when you're putting in teams that shouldn't be there. Like if I was 12-0 Oregon, and all of a sudden, for this year, if it was the 16-team playoff, that the model was the way that they proposed it, they would have had to play Army in the first round. So you're trying to tell me that my reward for going 12-0 is I got to go sit and play number 22 Army? That's just crazy to me. And I'm not discrediting anything that Jeff Monken and Army's done, because they've done a phenomenal job over the past decade or so, really, building up the procedure of that program. But come on, that's crazy.
That's why I said and that's why my thing was, and I talked about this, with a couple of people that I know, is that it needs to be some kind of, like I said, just a short minute ago, if you make it, where the first and second, seed or whatever get a bye for that first round, that's your goal. That's your reward for working so hard, is that you get to rest while these other teams are playing. You get to, take a breather. Maybe you've got somebody who's, banged up in the last game or two. They get that extra chance to kind of, maybe kind of, heal up a little bit so that they're ready to, go full bore into whoever you're playing, whether it be an Army or whether it be a Utah, or, maybe it's a Michigan that you got to play.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And now you're going to get to a point where part of the settlement's going to be about how many teams are a part of a conference. Then then eventually it's going to have to address what the NCAA's actual role is going to be in college athletics eventually, because obviously with the whole Tennessee lawsuit, they pretty much made the NCAA irrelevant in terms of actually regulating and governing and all that stuff too. And I know that this conversation is going to have to be a part 2 eventually, because we really don't know a lot of it, but it definitely seems like that we at least have a little bit of a tease in terms of what some of the ramifications potentially can be.
I think so. I think you're going to start seeing it probably sooner rather than later. I think you're getting to a point to where some of these bigger schools are going to turn around and say, what are we doing here? We hold all the power. What do we need the NCAA for anymore if we can just, kind of create our own, kind of Premier League for, for college football, all these teams, in the Big Ten, and whoever else comes along, you're the, Eastern Conference, and then SEC and whoever else comes along, you're the Western Conference. We play and then, kind of measure it down until you get to, a Final Four and then, play for a national championship. There's going to become a point where you don't need the NCAA because you refuse to, at least in my opinion, if you're the NCAA, you refuse to go after people kind of the same level. You pick and choose, you cherry pick who you want to go after and who you want to kind of hit the gong on. It's you look at North Carolina who they came after, but you didn't really go after Michigan just this past year when they had their their scandal. And you don't get to just pick and choose if you're the NCAA. You have to make it, a fair and even, kind of basis for why you're going against somebody.